Hi, I'm back, and in this series on psychotherapy and life, and some of the lessons that we might learn from psychotherapy and maybe apply to life. So let me just move the camera a little bit. I thought, as I indicated previously, that I would speak a little bit on boundaries. Now, since the last upload, I've been thinking about what to say. And really, when it comes to boundaries, there are so many possible things that one could say that it just ended up being too much to really allow for the short form videos that I like to post. Okay, so I did decide on a topic of sorts. So let's kick off this discussion with the notion of boundaries in psychotherapy. So boundaries in psychotherapy is a really important notion. The long and the short of it is that the therapist maintains what is generally called the therapeutic frame, and those things would include aspects such as management of time. For instance, that a patient may have a regularly scheduled time appointment, or another aspect of time that has to do with boundaries is that your session starts at a particular time, that it ends at a particular time, that to go over the time limits is a psychological violation of a boundary, and that it's meaningful in some way. One of the most well-known boundaries, of course, in psychotherapy, or let's say two of the most well-known boundaries, has to do with confidentiality. So any third-party involvement is generally to be avoided or strongly curtailed. Sometimes this is, there are contexts in which this is not strictly adhered to. For instance, if a child is in psychotherapy and the therapist feels it appropriate to provide the parents with some kind of feedback. For myself, for instance, I try to limit any kind of third-party involvement, but in South Africa, as in many Western countries, we have medical insurance, or as we call them, medical aids in South Africa, and they require certain kinds of information. For instance, a diagnostic code, an ICD-10, currently the ICD-10 code, for instance, and sometimes one has to write some form of motivation to ask for additional funds. So that is a third party that is involved in therapy. It's not ideal. This is why psychoanalysts of old had their patients pay them directly, and that the patient did the dealings with the third party. So while it's a kind of violation of privacy, it's obviously not sharing of content. The other well-known example is the prohibition on physical contact. Now, in psychoanalysis, this may go to the extent of not even shaking the hands of your patients. I personally don't adhere to that one, but there are analysts who do that. And again, the reason for this should be fairly obvious, and that is that neither the patient nor the therapist is supposed to have any form of physical gratification. In Freudian understanding, physical gratification would always be some form of erotic or libidinal, or has erotic or libidinal connotations. There are other fairly easily understood components to that. For instance, a patient who may have suffered sexual trauma. If, let's say, a woman came to see me and for whatever reason I touched this lady, that kind of intrusion in her personal space, in her physical space, might be very threatening, and certainly be counterproductive and not serve any clear psychological purpose. So those are some of the boundaries that are maintained in therapy. These are some of the well-known ones. There are many other examples of boundaries that are also maintained. Another fairly well-known one is that the therapist generally does not speak about his or her own life or life content. So the patient has the opportunity to fantasize about the therapist in whatever form it can take, and those fantasies can be worked with and can be understood in the context of the patient's psychological productions, rather than being relatively accurate representations of what might be going on in the life of the therapist. All of the boundaries that I have mentioned so far serve to protect the patient and sometimes the therapist. And the idea of protection here is that it fosters the therapeutic space. I can go on about boundaries in psychotherapy, but I think you get the idea. There are many ways to think of boundaries and ways to implement these boundaries. And in therapy, it is especially interesting when either the patient or the therapist in a minor or major way violates a boundary. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything in life outside of therapy? Well, again, there are many ways that we can apply this idea of boundaries, but I thought a way that might be interesting for you, the viewer, is to think of just everyday kinds of behavior and how these serve to act as boundaries. Just this morning I had a discussion with somebody around lying, and the example that the person gave, it seemed fairly clear to me that the person he was speaking about lies in an effort to manage his or her environment. Now, to some degree, that's probably always going to be true for any form of lying or any form of manipulation. But that brings to the table the notion of how we use speech to create distance or to create closeness. In other words, how speech can serve the function of being a boundary, whether an open boundary or a closed boundary. When one speaks in a highly scientific and objective matter, my God, speaking of language, and my own language abandons me in an instant. When somebody speaks in a very scientific, fact-based, objective manner, they create a certain kind of feeling. When somebody uses very sensual, warm, image-rich kind of language, it's again a very different kind of sensation being in a room with a person like that. So how we speak and the way we speak has to do with how close or how far we allow others to be. Now, of course, this is not only limited to speech. I'm using speech here as an example. Another fairly well-known one is how people go about using their physicality, their posture, and so on. There is fairly well-known research. I'm afraid I don't know, I can't recall who did the research and when, but where they asked certain violent criminals, rapists and robbers, muggers I think, to look at video clips of ordinary people just walking on the street and identifying who they would select as a target. And there was a high correlation between the people they selected as potential victims and people who have had previous incidents of violation, physical violation against them, whether sexual or some other form of violent intrusion. So not only do we carry the history of our lives and our boundaries or lack of boundaries in our posture and gait and manner, we also in a sense can create that. Partly based on my character and my profession, my training. I don't have a very physically inviting posture and very physically inviting manner. I would say outside of my private circle at least. And I'm aware of this, and it sort of fits in quite well with, like I said, my character and my profession. Other people are very, what we might term, touchy-feely, and they might reach out a lot. They might make contact with people. So the way one goes about utilizing your body and your gestures might either invite or disinvite closeness. Speaking of gestures, so somebody might make a gesture, a sort of a slow gesture or very fast kind of gesture, and again, the feeling that that gesture evokes is very different in each case. So a question that you may want to ask yourself is, what are very standard parts of my behavior, and what is the impression that it might make on somebody else? Now perhaps you want to create greater distance, and you may want to change certain behaviors that others might deem as inviting. Now remember, a boundary function in this way is very much a two-way street. So even if you may not think that somebody should be rebuffed or invited closer by any particular behavior, we have to understand that in that sense there are certain behaviors that rely on the interpretation of another, not only our own interpretation. So we have to keep in mind what somebody else might think of a particular behavior, not just what we think that behavior means. There are, I think, certain kinds of behavior or behavioral expressions that are fairly easy to understand. I think clothing is a relatively easy one to understand, that if somebody dresses in a sexually provocative way, or a way that might provoke a sexual response in another person, that clothing can be deemed as provocative. Now, this is not to say that people are not supposed to be able to control their own behavior, but we have to take a certain amount of responsibility for the way we portray ourselves as well. If somebody tends to wear very shapeless kinds of clothing and they do not understand why people are not attracted to them, there might be a clue in that. So sometimes people, for instance, become overweight as a way to create a kind of physical barrier. Sometimes they become terribly underweight, as in the form of anorexia, to also actually create a very potent kind of barrier. So what kind of behaviors do you use? I've had patients who were well aware of the fact that their smoking allowed them an escape from conversations, because they would claim the need for a cigarette and take a smoke break, and in doing so be able to move away from certain people. So what are very typical behaviors that you have? Maybe atypical behaviors? I don't know. Something that occurs, and this, when I speak of behavior, I mean any kind of behavioral expression, from clothing to eating to manners to tone of voice to content of speech. Yeah, so anything that is really visible or audible to another person, and how do these influence the boundaries around you? How would you like them to influence the boundaries? So we may come back to the notion of boundaries, but I thought this would be a little bit more interesting to provoke some thought. I hope that it was thought-provoking, and I would like to invite you to give comments, questions perhaps. If I can answer them, I would gladly try to. So until next time, thank you for your time and attention, and speak again soon.